The Tatmadaw is the official name of the Armed Forces of Myanmar. It is administered by the Ministry of Defense and composed of the Army, the Navy and the Air Force. Auxiliary services include the Myanmar Police Force and the People's Militia units. According to the Constitution of Myanmar, the Tatmadaw directly reports to the National Defense and Security Council led by the President of Myanmar. The NDSC is an 11-member National Security Council responsible for security and defense affairs. In Myanmar, the NDSC serves as the highest authority in the government of Myanmar. Currently, there is no military draft in Myanmar. Thus, all service personnel are theoretically volunteers, but the People's Militia law allows for conscription if the President considers it necessary for Myanmar's defense that the provisions of the law be activated. The Tatmadaw has been engaged in a bitter battle with ethnic insurgents and the narco armies since the country gained its independence from the United Kingdom in 1948, and has played a central role in Burmese politics since the 1962 coup d'état. Recently, the Tatmadaw has been widely accused by international organizations of human rights offenses, including ethnic cleansing, torture, sexual assault and massacre of civilians. The Royal Armed Forces was the armed forces of the Burmese monarchy from the 9th to 19th centuries. It refers to the military forces of the Pagan dynasty, the Ava kingdom, the Tungu dynasty and the Konbong dynasty in chronological order. The army was one of the major armed forces of Southeast Asia until it was defeated by the British. Over a 6-decade span in the 19th century, the army was organized into a small standing army of a few thousand, which defended the capital and the palace, and a much larger conscription-based wartime army. Conscription was based on the Ahemudan system, which required local chiefs to supply their predetermined quota of men from their jurisdiction on the basis of population in times of war. The wartime army also consisted of elephantry, cavalry, artillery and naval units. Firearms, first introduced from China in the late 14th century, became integrated into strategy only gradually over many centuries. The first special musket and artillery units, equipped with Portuguese matchlocks and cannon, were formed in the 16th century. Outside the special firearm units, there was no formal training program for the regular conscripts, who were expected to have a basic knowledge of self-defense and how to operate the musket on their own. As the technological gap between European powers widened in the 18th century, the army was dependent on Europeans' willingness to sell more sophisticated weaponry. While the army had held its own against the armies of the kingdom's neighbors, its performance against more technologically advanced European armies deteriorated over time. While it defeated the Portuguese and French intrusions in the 17th and 18th centuries respectively, the army could not stop the advance of the British Empire in the 19th century, losing all 3 Anglo-Burmese wars. On the 1st of January 1886, the millennium-old Burmese monarchy and its military arm, the Royal Burmese Army, were formally abolished by the British. The British used mainly Indian and Nepalese Gurkha troops to conquer and pacify the country. In a divide-and-rule maneuver, the British enforced their rule in the province of Burma mainly with Indian troops later joined by indigenous military units of 3 indigenous ethnic minorities, Karens, Kachins and Chins. The British did not trust the Burmese. Before 1937, with few exceptions, no Burmese were allowed to serve in the military. At the beginning of World War I, the only indigenous military regiment in the British India Army, the 70th Burma Rifles, consisted of 3 battalions, made up of Karens, Kachins and Chins. During the war, the British relaxed the ban, raising a Burmese battalion in the 70th Burma Rifles, a Burmese company in the 85th Burma Rifles, and 7 Burmese mechanical transport companies. In addition, 3 companies of Burma sappers and miners, made up of mostly Burmese, and a company of labor corps, made up of Chins and Burmese, were also raised. All these units began their overseas assignment in 1917. The 70th Burma Rifles served in Egypt for garrison duties while the Burmese labor corps served in France. One company of Burma sappers and miners distinguished themselves in Mesopotamia at the crossing Tigris. After the First World War, the British stopped recruiting Burmese and discharged all but one Burmese companies had been abolished by 1925. The last Burmese company of Burma sappers and miners too was disbanded in 1929. The British used Indian and ethnic minority-dominated troops to ruthlessly put down ethnic majority-dominated rebellions such as Saya Sans Peasant Rebellion in 1930-1931. These policies would lead to long-term negative tensions among the country's ethnic groups. On one